Hello, and welcome to the Law Patrol, proudly presented by Gleister Legal. On this channel, we take a look at all things legal and lawful as they happen in Australia and around the world. We review concepts, cases, and just generally shoot the breeze. While we don't give advice, we can answer some questions and hopefully point you in the right direction. As we cover everything legal and don't shy away from the hard topics, we may occasionally cover themes or discussions that some may find disturbing or distasteful. So if necessary, make yourself a cup of concrete, put on your big kid pants and pull up a chair. If you have any questions or comments about anything we discuss, please don't hesitate to reach out by email at info@gleisterlegal.com.au, follow us on Facebook, and remember to hit like and subscribe. Now, let's get into it.
Good afternoon and welcome to this first episode of The Law Patrol, which we are tentatively calling Famously Above the Law. Given everything that's going on with the interest in the Heard and Depp case over in the States, thought it might be a prudent time to actually take a look at some of the ways that Australian laws have been infringed upon or bent or certain similar by, international celebrities and, people here in Australia. So just by way of introduction, my name is Hayden Gleister. I'm the managing principal at Gleister Legal. I've been practicing in law for I've been working in law for over a decade. I've been practicing as a solicitor on my own for 6 or 7 years now, from the top of my head. I mainly act in transactional law, property conveyancing, commercial leases. Do a little bit of litigation as the need arises, but generally do whatever I can to help wherever I can. So, look, for the most part, I'm a jack of all trades. I'll certainly touch on or research pretty much anything, except I generally try not to touch family law or criminal law. It's just not my specialty. Now, so look, getting into it, what I thought I'd cover would be 2 or 3 sort of areas. The main one being Novak Djokovic and what happened with the Australian Open, and then touch just slightly on what happened with Hopkins during the Australian lockdowns. Moving on, I will be looking at what happened in 2015 with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp and their dogs, Pistol and Boo. Because although my colleagues over in the US, Alita at Legal Bites, Rich at Hogan Law, Kurt, Uncivil Law, sorry, Joe, I've completely forgotten the name of the stream. Good Logic, my sincere apologies. And Joe and Rob at Law and Lumber. Now, they're doing a fantastic job of reviewing the Heard v. Depp defamation case and what's going on in Washington at the moment in Fairfax County. I strongly advise you to go and have a look, see their commentary. It is absolutely brilliant. But that sort of brought up some questions again as to what happened with Amber and Johnny here in 2015 when there weren't potentially punches flying and when basically they were getting into a stash with politicians here in Australia. So, look, you could be forgiven for thinking that Australia, having been in the grip of a global pandemic recently, that examples of celebs flouting laws would be few and far between. There's still the odd person that'll tell the tale of Paul Hogan and his decade-long battle with the ATO. It's been over 2 decades since people commented on what happened with John Laws and Alan Jones and what sort of money they were receiving for hidden sponsorships, similar items like that. And look, frankly, the less said about Rolf Harris, the better, as far as I'm concerned. Look, in recent years, the most high-profile instances of celebs showing disdain for the laws in Australia has related to that dreaded word quarantine. In the last few years, aside from the outrage of celebs receiving preferential treatment and crossing borders into Australia during the pandemic while there were still Australians stranded overseas, which in and of itself was morally bereft but not illegal, there were a few that took it further. Setting aside the rights of Australian citizens stranded overseas, some of whom I might say did lodge a petition with the United Nations Human Rights Committee for them to intervene. and there's differing treatment between the rich and the poor. The prices of flights went up, making it very difficult. But for the most part, whether you liked it or not, the rules were the rules. And most people abided by them, barring the occasional idiotic large gathering, and then posting your activities on social media, not really the brightest thing to do. But in terms of celebs during the lockdown, we had visits from Ed Sheeran, Melissa McCarthy, Idris Elba, Chris Pratt, everyone who was more than happy to toe the line and act like normal people. I mean, people got photos of Natalie Portman just going down and doing a shopping at Bondi. It was just, and she was following the rules, doing what was necessary to reside in Australia during a global pandemic. I will add that there were also a number of Aussie celebrities who, as far as I'm concerned, can literally do no wrong. People like Hugh Jackman, Isla Fisher, Margot Robbie, and, God of Thunder himself, Chris Hemsworth. If I can ever get any of those on this channel, any of these people to be on the channel to discuss things, I'll be more than happy to try. But look, then there were people like Novak Djokovic and the perennial pain in the world's collective behind Katie Hopkins. Djokovic entered the country having had a positive-ish result. There's some disruption as to when and where that actually took place. I know that there's an official timeline, but you never can tell. We'll never 100% know. He was detained at Melbourne Airport and quarantined while lawyers argued over whether or not the government had the right to cancel his visa. Hopkins, on the other hand, who was in Australia for Big Brother VIP, which again is another morally questionable issue, was fined $1,000 for deliberately placing quarantine staff and others in danger by opening the door without protective gear. Although, given she was also planning on flashing her wrinkly tuchus to the rest of the staff, I think the fine probably should have been far higher. She was then deported back to the UK, although I'm not sure that they wanted her either. Look, and then there is the Depp v. Heard defamation trial, which is entering its final days in Fairfax County, Virginia, which, for those of us that don't live in the US or who are just geographically not inclined, I'm not even sure if that's a word, that's basically, it's just outside Washington, near the actual White House, as in White House, Washington. And questions there are being raised as to what happened in Queensland with Depp and Heard in May 2015. Again, while I'm leaving the details of the abuse and the assaults to my colleagues over at LawTube, I do want to touch on what's been called Australia's war on Terrier. While Amber Heard alleges that she didn't know, but that she illegally brought her and Johnny's dogs, Pistol and Boo, into Australia via a private jet, which caused an absolute grumpy storm. But look, we'll start with the other international issues. Firstly, Novak Djokovic and getting his balls returned back overseas and being willing to miss tournaments instead of being forced to take a vaccine. What I'll do is, there we go, bring that up. Now, this is sort of getting the horse before the cart, but as you can see, he was out of the Australian Open after the federal court dismissed his visa bid. Now, by way of a quick rundown, on the 18th of November, he was granted a temporary 408 visa to enter Australia and participate in the Australian Open. On the 29th of November, while the rest of us were still reeling from lockdowns, the then Federal Minister for Health advised Tennis Australia that players wishing to enter Australia quarantine-free must be fully vaccinated and cannot count a previous infection as a reason for a medical exemption. Now, Djokovic then proceeded to rely on that, on having had COVID previously as a medical exemption, but we'll get into that. According to Djokovic, on the 16th of December, he took both a PCR test and a rapid antigen test. And then he attended various events, presses, meeting with kids, that sort of thing, the next day, having not yet received a positive result. Then again, on the next day, on December 18th, he took part in a media interview, this time knowing full well that he had a positive PCR test. On December 30th, he was advised by Tennis Australia that he'd been granted a medical exemption from COVID vaccination on the grounds that he'd recently recovered from COVID. Now, keep in mind, this is after the Australian government had already specifically told Tennis Australia that that was not a legitimate exemption and people coming into play had to be fully vaccinated. He arrived in Australia at Melbourne Airport just before midnight on the 5th of January 2022. And he was pretty much interviewed into the early hours of the morning of the 6th of January by Border Force officials. Eventually, they decided that based on his answers, I mean, look, he previously refused to confirm what his vaccination status was. He advised them that he was unvaccinated. The Border Force officials decided to cancel his visa under Section 116 of the Migration Act, and he was subsequently sent to hotel quarantine. Later that day, he instructed lawyers to get an injunction to keep him in Australia until the 10th of January, at which time there was supposed to be a hearing in front of the Federal Court, Federal Circuit Court, which for anyone outside Australia or who doesn't know, Federal Circuit Court's really our lowest rung of the Federal Court. From there, you've got the full sitting of the full court of the Federal Court, and beyond that, you're really jumping up to make an appeal to the High Court of Australia. And look, there was no real way that that was ever going to happen in this case. Excuse me if I'm a little bit croaky. So at the hearing on the January 10th, the court found that his visa had been unreasonably cancelled, basically for lack of procedural fairness, particularly given that he was advised of a very short time period in which he could contest the decision to cancel his visa. Sorry, just had a little bit of a... On Friday, January 14th, the then immigration minister took the reasonably unusual step of exercising his own powers under Section 133 of the Migration Act and cancelled Djokovic's visa himself. Again, Djokovic's lawyers lodged an appeal, which was partially heard on the Saturday, and then referred to the full bench of the federal court for a hearing on the following Sunday. Now, look, that is reasonably unusual for the court to have to sit on the weekend, but obviously where there's extenuating circumstances, the immediacy of the Australian Open, that sort of thing, I do think there might have been a small amount of preferential treatment there, but that's purely my opinion. On the Sunday, Djokovic's application was dismissed by the full court and he was deported later that evening. Don't necessarily disagree. I did watch the trial, parts of the hearings myself, I should say. It was reasonably dry, but then again, what do you expect when you're talking about federal Commonwealth migration law? It was all done mostly via Zoom from memory. But look, let's look at the relevant legal stuff. As I mentioned before, the government had specifically declared that the players must be vaccinated in order to participate in the Australian Open. The original declaration of the cancellation of his visa by the staff at the Border Force was done under Section 116 of the Migration Act, which basically says that the minister, via their delegate, may, subject to various other subsections that did not apply, cancel a visa if he or she is satisfied that the presence of its holder in Australia is or may be or would or might be a risk to, specifically, the health, safety, or good order of the Australian community or a segment of the Australian community. Now, the section that ultimately cancelled the visa, which was the minister exercising his own powers, under Section 133 of the Migration Act, states that the minister may cancel a visa held by a person if the minister is satisfied that a ground for cancelling the visa under Section 116 exists, and the minister is satisfied that it would be in the public interest to cancel the visa. Given that the decision to cancel his visa by the Border Force people at the airport on 6th of January was overturned, we're more focusing on Section 133. Now, Section 133 is quite discretionary by its wording. Use of the words of may, risk, and health and safety and good order leaves much of the exercise of the minister's powers open to interpretation. The minister only really needed to be satisfied that Djokovic's presence in Australia may cause unrest. Satisfaction, to my belief, is a relatively low hurdle. in order for Djokovic to contest the exercise of the power, he would have had to show that the minister's decision was reached unreasonably or otherwise on improper or unlawful grounds. Now, there were a number of arguments. I'm not going to go through all of them because it was a considerably long judgment, but it basically boiled down to, was the minister satisfied that Djokovic posed a risk to the health of the community? Look, he had a low risk of transmission, having previously been infected at the time, although I'm not quite sure how the medical exemption has ever really worked. With all the variants and whatnot, it's been evidenced previously that it is possible to contract COVID after having already contracted it. It's not like other diseases where you receive it and you're automatically immune. That's why we had to have 2, 3, 4 doses of vaccination. At least that's my understanding anyway. Look, as I said, he had a low risk of transmission having been previously infected, but did his anti-vaccine stance have other implications? And additionally, was the minister satisfied that Djokovic posed a risk to the good order of the community? The minister relied upon the various protests and other extraneous factors to say that he was reasonably confident and satisfied to say that Djokovic's presence may be a source of discord and create public disruption. Now, as I said, there's a lot of discretionary language in there. May, satisfied, that sort of thing. It's all subject to, although you're looking at the facts on particular matters, it's subject to interpretation as to what the minister believed at the time. And yes, he had reasonable grounds based on the information that was provided. I mean, in the end, it was an exercise of governmental powers to exclude a foreign national who may be considered as a result to have become an anti-vax icon. Whether or not Djokovic believes that himself, sort of neither here nor there. So what's the upshot of all this? The full court of the federal court upheld the minister's decision to cancel Djokovic's visa, and he's been banned from entering Australia for at least 3 years. This may be revisited under certain circumstances, but I would think it unlikely, particularly given Australia's new government in power. It has ended Djokovic's 17-year run of winning the Australian Open, which has been in place since 2005. I honestly can't say that I feel sorry for him. He was coming into our country with full knowledge of the laws in place, what the current political climate was, what Australia had been through, or he reasonably ought to have known. And he was coming to play in a tournament for more money than some everyday Australians will ever amass in their entire lifetimes. And he still didn't follow the rules. So it's too bad, so sad as far as I'm concerned. Now, how about we move on to the professional grumpy stirrer that is Katie Hopkins. So, in July 2021, Katie Hopkins hopped a flight to Australia in order to be on Big Brother VIP. The less said about that particular slice of reality TV, the better, in my opinion. At the time, our two largest cities, Melbourne and Sydney, were both under mandatory lockdowns to varying degrees, and there was still more than 34,000 Australians stranded overseas. Hopkins was put up in a hotel quarantine. I can't remember if that's taxpayer funded or not. I'm fairly confident it would have been. And she was put in there just like everyone else that had been coming in from overseas. For her, though, it was all just one big joke. She broke the quarantine requirements, risking not only her own health, but potentially those of the frontline workers and security staff. For people that think that it might not be such a big deal, you've got to remember there were instances here in Australia of coronavirus passing through the air vents through hotels and all sorts of other interactions. I mean, look, without being too graphic, there was an instance of it escaping, quote, quarantine because a security guard supposedly slept with a person that was in quarantine. Now, I can neither confirm nor deny the legitimacy of any of that, but obviously it was necessary to take certain steps, and Hopkins clearly thought that the whole thing was just beyond her. her most notable breach was deliberately opening the door without a mask on. I can't remember if she actually coughed on somebody or to have a go at a staff member. In addition to that, she was quoted as having planned to flash whatever poor soul came to the door. I believe she wanted to have a conversation with a particular member of the military that was monitoring that particular hotel while she was Starkers, which I thought was less than appropriate. When the matter was referred to Australian Border Force, they acted quickly, issued her a $1,000 fine, which for those in the US is roughly $770. They booted her and her violence back to the UK on the next flight. Now look, finally, let's talk about the pistol and boo in the room. Let me just bring up. Okay. Now, look, I'll be perfectly honest. I've been watching the Depp and Heard trial again through commentary from other streams, other sources. It's been absolutely amazing. I went into it with a completely open mind. I decided, like many others, to let the evidence play for itself. Once I got to a certain point in the trial, I did go beyond that and visited the Fairfax County website to look at the evidence myself, see what I'd be impressed by. So yeah, but let's actually have a look at what happened with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard and their dogs in 2015. Now, look, I just want to clarify, I don't profess to take a side in what's going on. I'm just trying to report so that everybody out there knows exactly, or as near as there too as possible, what goes on. Because if anything from the coverage of the Depp and Heard trial in Fairfax has been anything to go by, we really can't be trusting mainstream media at the moment. And this is really something that's just needs to be clarified. So what actually happened? Again, this involves quarantine, but this time of a different kind. In July 2015, Amber Heard flew by private jet from Hawaii to Queensland with Pistol and Boo, her and Johnny's Yorkshire Terriers. On arriving in Australia, she filled out the customs forms, ticking a box stating that she had nothing to declare, including animals, etc. For clarification, Pistol and Boo should have been declared and spent 10 to 14 days in quarantine, as Australia has very strict quarantine regulations to prevent diseases such as rabies from spreading to its shores. Just as another example, I mean, at one point there was a 400-kilometre wide stretch of area that was placed under mandatory quarantine because they were worried about fruit flies. So we do take this stuff seriously because it is fertile land. It is critical to our infrastructure. And yes, we do take things seriously. The dogs being in Australia were later discovered when a photo of them was posted to social media by a local dog groomer. Now, in regards to that, I think that was probably a mistake on their part, but I think it was an innocent mistake. I think it was purely just they were excited to see the dogs and have famous clientele. I can't blame them for that. Now, the then Agricultural Minister, Barnaby Joyce, who in my opinion is generally unlikable and thankfully has been ousted from being our Deputy Prime Minister in the recent election, which was about 4 days ago from memory. Yep, 4 days. Which, for those in the US, given the different systems, just to explain, it's probably as close to being as a Vice President of the US as you can get, but without the illusion of actual power. Now, Barnaby got into a war of words with Depp and Heard, basically saying that there's no preferential treatment here. You come into our nation, you have to abide by our biosecurity protocols. Now, there's nothing specifically wrong with that. The issue I have is with what happened next. He then basically threatened to have the dogs put down if they didn't bugger off back to the United States within 72 hours. Depp and Heard later appeared on Jimmy Kimmel, pretty much taking the piss out of Barnaby, which I can't say I blame them, but that's my opinion. And they were joking that Joyce had a point about the dogs potentially affecting the Australian environment, especially when you consider that Australia has the most poisonous creatures on Earth. Now, look, while I tend to agree, I mean, I wake up most mornings and have to dodge any number of things that are considerably more dangerous than a couple of Yorkshire Terriers. I mean, the drop bears alone have caused my insurance premiums on my car to go through the roof. But yeah, it really wasn't appropriate with how they've sort of dealt with it. I mean, it's one thing to mock a politician. It's another to have a go at an entire country when, you know, we've been nice enough to have you here to film movies and give tax breaks for movies and all sorts of other things. But yeah, anyway. Yeah, so Pistol and Boo subsequently hopped a flight home as they had 72 hours to get out of Dodge. Amber was later charged with 2 counts of importing the dogs into Australia and a further count of producing a false document. The importation charge had a maximum of 10 years in jail plus a 100k fine, so 77 odd K US at the time, I believe. While the false document charge carried a penalty of up to a year and a further 10k fine, being, you know, what, roughly $7,000 US. In my opinion, Heard got off relatively lightly. I think the statements along the lines of her never wanting to return to Australia probably had a bit to do with that. I think that the Australian government also had, I think the negotiations that were done were necessary, but I don't think that anyone really came out smelling like roses. I mean, as you can see from the pictures here, what's on screen is a photo screenshot from the apology video that the Australian government had Amber and Johnny put together as part of the, we'll call it a plea agreement. It's not necessarily strictly true, but we'll call it that. Because the government had them star in an apology video that basically many have described as looking like a hostage video. Personally, I think Heard's acting in that video is far better than anything I've seen her do on the stand in the current defamation case. But it was very staged, very put on. Yes, it talks about Australians' ecosystems and why it's necessary to protect them, but it was very much as if someone had put a gun to their head and said, here, read this. They came off as if they didn't really care. It wasn't really what they wanted to do, which, I mean, look, yes, no one wants to apologise, but at the same time, you put in a little bit more effort. I mean, there's supposedly high-class quality stars that are, yeah, well, I mean, look, you can watch for yourself. Just a snippet. Oh, I don't actually think that worked. Well, anyway, look, sorry about that, guys. Teething issues, first stream. I honestly think that I can probably leave it there. I mean, if you want to go and have a look at the video yourself, be my guest. It's one way to waste 40 seconds to a minute of your life that you'll never get back. But in any case, look, I just want to say thank you for joining us at the Law Patrol for our very first ever stream. And hopefully you've learned something. If you have any questions about the Australian legal system or any questions in general, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, have a good day. Keep safe. Keep healthy, wealthy, and wise. We'll see you later.